Hey, Cypher here. This one's gonna be kind of weird. I want to talk about stars on flags. Yes, those stars. This is a really weird subject and I couldn't find much in terms of sourcing for it, but I just wanted to talk about it. Because, surprisingly enough, stars on flags have a lot of different meanings, but they also are kind of weird in terms of what they mean. I was prompted to do this by a professor of mine named Sam Truitt when we were talking about filibusters, because a lot of filibusters put stars on their flags. And there seems to be a tradition of putting stars on flags as a way of saying, hey, we're here and we want to be annexed by the United States, because the United States has stars on its flag to represent each state. But you'll find that the actual stars initially on our flag, let alone those filibuster flags, had kind of an ambiguous meaning. In fact, stars on flags don't necessarily mean anything, especially when given the larger historical context. So when you see the star on California's flag, for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean that they wanted to be annexed by the United States. In fact, the star on the California flag is referring to the red star of the Alvarado flag from when they seceded in 1836 from Mexico. As in, California seceded from Mexico in 1836, joined again, fought Mexico, joined again, kind of denied being part of Mexico, and then suddenly the Bear Flaggers came about and took it away from the Mexicans altogether. And as a historian of California, I'm pretty sure that Alvarado did not put that red star on his flag in 1836 to signify that he wanted to be annexed by the United States. Yet the Bear Flaggers were definitely fighting Alvarado and Pio Pico, who was currently governor at the time. So it's an interesting but kind of weird subject, and we have to go way back. I mean, thousands of years back, to even begin to grasp how stars have been used on various flags and what, in general, they could mean, because it's not as simple as wanting to be annexed by the United States. There is actually a specific term for stars on flags, at least in terms of European heraldry. It's called a mullet. Not that kind, this kind. Yes, long before the United States, the mullet was being used as a symbol of independence. For instance, George Washington's family had stars on their coat of arms from at least the 15th century. Yes, George Washington had 5-pointed stars as a symbol for his family hundreds of years before he was born. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of mullets, and we can keep going further and further back. In fact, we can go all the way back to at least the 12th century BC. A lot of ancient kingdoms would mark their boundaries with giant stone reliefs. In the case of Meli-Shipak II, a Babylonian king in the early 12th century BC, one of those boundary stones is carved with a crescent, moon, and star. The same kind of symbology would be found in Egyptian hieroglyphics, Assyrian remains, and all kinds of Mesopotamian kingdoms. In fact, there's a possibility of it going further back beyond the 12th century, all the way to the 3rd dynasty of Ur, as in the 22nd century BC. That's 4 millennia ago. But by the time the Babylonians and Assyrians were fighting over territory, they were using the star as a representation for their god Ishtar. Of course, Ishtar goes all the way back to Sumer, so it's quite possible that the Sumerians were using Ishtar as their symbol for boundary stones, but we really don't know. Her symbol was that 8-pointed star. And this would morph through the ages, especially when Hellenism swept the region in the 4th century BC. Eventually, the star and crescent became the symbol of Byzantium. That was in the 1st century BC, and it stuck. The star and crescent for a millennium was associated with Byzantium and later named Constantinople. You see it on reliefs for the Byzantine Empire well until their end. And the symbol spread from there. It became a symbol for Persia, and sometimes even the Roman Empire as a whole. As late as the 13th century, Templars started using it as their own symbol during the Crusades. And this is partially why the star and crescent was used by the Saracens, because they saw it as their symbol as well. So we can find some medieval depictions of fights between Saracens and Crusaders, both of which are using stars. But significantly, the star started being used as just a star by knights of Europe. We typically associate the Star and Crescent with Islam today, but it has a long history which predates Islam by thousands of years. But this is also where there's a break in use of star and crescent to just star as a form of heraldry. This is where the mullet comes in. Since the star was being used by knights for centuries to represent their own family, people started using it in different ways. Some cities started taking on the symbol for their flags. For instance, Maastricht, in the modern-day Netherlands, had adapted a flag by at least 1438 that anyone today would recognize as some sort of Lone Star flag. Its flag today is pretty much the same as what it was when it was depicted in 1545. When the United States finally resolved to create a flag in 1777, it was building upon this long tradition of using stars as representations of sovereignty. But in the wording of the bill that created the standard for the stars on the flag, they made it fairly clear what they were expecting it to represent. They said that the flag of the 13 United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white. That the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation. They were basically saying the 13 stars was a new constellation, that there were stars in the sky representing a new country. Now there's a bit of a possibility that the flag was kind of a tribute to David Rittenhouse. He was a major American astronomer, famous for observing the transit of Venus. In fact, the first coin ever struck by the United States in 1783 was called the Nova Constellatio, or in other words, New Constellation, and David Rittenhouse was actually consulted on the design. It too had the 13 stars representing the 13 states. So that's it, right? Stars on flags just represent sovereignty. Not exactly. Because you know how I started this with the whole debate over whether or not the California flag was representing an intention to be annexed by the United States? Well, we have definitive examples of using that symbol for those specific purposes. In particular, there was this weird incident that happened with West Florida. It was part of the Spanish colonies, including a place called Baton Rouge. And in 1810, this area of Spanish control had a fairly minor rebellion, where the Republic of West Florida was proclaimed. It only lasted for 74 days, but right after that period, the US annexed the territory. And can you guess what they used as their flag? That's right, as blatantly obvious as possible, a blue field with a white, five-pointed star. One could easily call this an early filibuster, but that too is kind of a treacherous term. But of course, the Spanish were having enough trouble in Europe, and they didn't really have the power to project anything into West Florida. So as early as 1810, we can see stars on flags being used to say, hey, I want to be annexed. Texas, when it seceded from Mexico, also adopted a flag. After all, they're known as the Lone Star Republic. They went through a bunch of flags between 1835 and 1839. Some of them were pretty blatantly trying to call out for the United States to annex them. But there was also this weird thing that happened prior to the Texas Revolt with the creation of Coahuila y Tejas. Basically, Mexico tried to combine these two departments into one unified department. And Coahuila y Tejas technically came before most of the Texan flags. And its flag had 2 stars. So it's also possible that Texas was using those stars as part of its heraldry. There had been Texan flags prior to the Revolution that incorporated the Lone Star. For instance, James Long's expedition, which was definitely a filibuster expedition, was blatantly using the star as a call for annexation by the United States. And the famous Come and Take It flag, though it is of disputable authenticity, also had a star on it, although it wasn't calling for independence at all. Plus the creation of another rebel state, called the Republic of the Rio Grande, incorporated 3 stars on its own flag. And a year later, another rebellion took place, creating the Republic of the Yucatan, and they too adopted a flag with stars on it. and they were definitely not fighting to be annexed by the United States. The Republic of the Yucatan remained an independent republic from Mexico all the way until 1848, when an internal revolt basically made them have to ask for help from Mexico, eventually leading to their re-annexation by Mexico. So prior to 1846, you've got 4 independent republics being created out of Mexican territory, all of which were using stars for their flags. Of course, something I've neglected to mention since the beginning of this is that California definitely talked about allowing itself to be annexed by the United States from as early as 1836, but they never resolved to do so. But the Mexican-American War kinda solved that whole problem anyways. So Texas, California, and even New Mexico, which was never part of these secessionist movements, save for one small rebellion that was easily suppressed, they were all part of the United States now, by right of conquest. Of course, that didn't stop Americans from wanting to expand their territory even further. One significant example was Narciso Lopez. This guy filibustered into Cuba a couple of times and eventually was caught and executed. Some of his calls to action made specific that he wanted to have Cuba be annexed by the United States. And can you guess what flag he used to proclaim the Cuban Republic that would have eventually been annexed by the United States? That's right, today's flag for Cuba has a star in it that was initially meant to say, "Annex us, United States." Even though he was caught and executed with extreme prejudice, there were a whole bunch of other filibusters who basically tried to do the same thing, most noteworthy of which was William Walker, whose flags for Baja California, Sonora, and eventually Nicaragua all incorporated stars with the obvious intent of eventually being annexed by the United States. So now we have 2 meanings for the star on the flag. It could either mean just pure sovereignty, or it could mean, hey, annex us, United States. Make us the next star on your flag. But there is one more meaning that eventually came about, and that's thanks to the Soviets. The Red Star of Revolution. Now obviously the Red Star had many meanings prior to 1917. For instance, here's a picture of a US Army plane that had a red star on its tail in 1915, because the Army Signal Corps used that as a symbol. It's not clear exactly where the Red Star of Revolution came from, but it was adopted by the Red Army in 1918. And so we see it on all the flags of the USSR and all the other Soviet states that followed that. And we see it on a bunch of other communist states' flags. For instance, sometimes they reverse the colors, such as China, just for effect. But communist China's star could easily be referring to the various star flags that have flown over China since 1911. It's not really clear what the 5 stars actually represent on the current Chinese flag, but it could represent the 5 largest ethnic groups. Of course, the original description of the flag states that the large star symbolizes the Communist Party, and the smaller stars represent the 4 classes. So yeah, now we have 3 possible meanings for any stars on flags. Just simple sovereignty, the willingness to be annexed by the United States, or communism. Of course, there's a few other ones I've skipped over here, for brevity's sake. I mean, after all, I'm covering something like 4,000 years of history in just this diatribe. For instance, the flag of Israel has the Star of David, which is an obvious call-out to their faith. And that doesn't really fit into any kind of generalized model of the meaning of stars on flags. So it's also quite possible that each individual instance of putting a star on a flag has its own purposeful meaning. But that's what makes this whole thing weird and interesting. They don't always have a definite meaning. It's all based on an ancient symbol for a god that nobody worships anymore, that they just left carved into rocks in various places. So looping all the way back to that question, is that red star on the California flag supposed to represent willingness to be annexed by the United States? Even though it's a red star, it's obviously not meant to represent communism, given that Marx wouldn't write his manifesto for another 2 years after its creation, although I suspect there's going to be a few comments saying that it totally represents that now. California, but it also could just be a call out to that Alvarado flag prior, which simply represented sovereignty. Short of them telling us exactly that at the time, recorded and passed down in perfect accuracy, we can never know. And so it's up to us interpreting the entire context of the symbol to come up with the best meaning we can derive. And that's how a lot of meaning works. You gotta look at the context, because context is for kings.